Welcome, searchers and seekers. We are now going to cover the Book of Numbers, Bamidbar, or as it's known in Hebrew, in the wilderness. So, in the beginning of the chapter 1, it says, the Lord spoke to Moses. So, Yahweh spoke to Moses in the wilderness of the Sinai. So, they're in the wilderness. Bamidbar, where we get the name in Hebrew for the text, and there is a census for all men over 20, and the census is a counting of numbers, hence the name that we also have for Numbers. In chapter 1, verse 21, those enrolled in the tribe of Reuben were 46,000. So there's 12 tribes, so these are very large numbers, and they are probably hyperbole or exaggeration. In chapter 1, verse 48, the Levites are talked about and their special role as priests, and they watch out for the tent and the tabernacle. And in verse 51, any outsider who comes near it shall be put to death. So this is a very serious religion and dark in many ways at this time, being put to death for being too near the tabernacle is very serious. In Numbers chapter 5, we see some description of cleanliness and uncleanliness. And the Israelites are to avoid anyone who is leprous, and leprous is a term for any sort of skin disease, any sort of boils or pustules or leprosy or any sort of disease of the skin that is visible. And also, if there are discharges from the body, that is also unclean. And also, corpse is very unclean. So those are kept outside of the camp. And in verse 3, it says, where I dwell among them, where I, Yahweh, dwell among them. So the conception of God here is a God who actually is in the camp with them. So it's a localized God, Yahweh is. It's not this universal God that is up in heaven somewhere or just dispersed through the universe. This is actually a very localized deity who lives in the camp with them. Chapter 5, verse 11 and following, we have these laws about an unfaithful wife. And here we see the bias and the patriarchy of the Hebrew scriptures because it's concerned with an unfaithful wife. What about an unfaithful husband? And so the description here is that the woman shall be brought before the Lord, and there is special writing, special water. It looks like sort of this magical trial of sorts, but there is a way for the woman to come out innocent. But nevertheless, you'll see this almost magical, shamanistic trial process, almost like a witch trial. And so not one of the most enlightened part of the Old Testament. In chapter 6 of Numbers, the text talks about the Nazarites, men who take a special vow. No razor shall come near their head. They cannot drink wine or even grape juice or grapes. So they are very sober, very set aside. In 6:22 and following, we have a very famous priestly benediction, which you may have heard in Jewish or Christian services. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, thus shall you bless the Israelites. You shall say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So shall they put my name on the Israelites, and I will bless them. So that is a very famous blessing here in Numbers or Bamidbar. In 9:15, we have an account of the cloud and the fire leading this massive set of the 12 tribes. And during the day, there's a cloud, so you could see the cloud during the day, and at night there would be a fire. So Yahweh was actually leading them along. In 10:35, whenever the ark set out, Moses would say, "Arise, O Lord, O Yahweh, let your enemies be scattered, and your foes flee before you." So I mention this because it's a very strange and a very militaristic prayer. So it's the sense that the tribes are traveling in the desert and that God is sort of a divine warrior fighting for them. In chapter 11, we get the start of these stories of the people complaining. And the response of Yahweh is often anger, as in the first verses of the chapter. Now, when the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes, the Lord Yahweh heard it, and his anger was kindled. So here we have a very emotional deity, and then one who lashes out. And the fire of the Lord burned against them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. But Moses comes in, prays to Yahweh, and the fire stops. And that's where you get a sense of the name of the supposed place, Taberah, or a burning. So this is a very common occurrence in the wilderness, in Numbers, of the people complaining, Moses stepping in, and you get a very angry and emotional God. So this, again, is very different from many people's conception of divinity, of a God in heaven who is beyond really the human emotion of anger over particular things. Here we have a very emotional God who is almost is anthropomorphic, who is conceived anthropomorphically, like as if they're the divine, as if human emotions are then attributed to the divine. That's what I mean by um, anthropomorphizing of God. So God is seen as very much like a human being who gets angry, who lashes out, who becomes even a little vindictive. And this is not the universal God of pure love, pure being, but a God very involved with these people when they complain. The people complain that they were, yes, maybe slaves in Egypt, but they at least had meat there and many things to eat, melons, leeks, onions, garlic. So they had really good food, even though they were slaves. Uh, that is a little bit funny, but they're also complaining about their strength is gone, and they even complain about the manna that they have, supposedly God's miraculous gift. So they complain, and this could be another version of what had occurred in Exodus. So you get a doublet, somehow the same story told twice in the text. So the story goes on. It's very interesting. The Lord becomes very angry. Yahweh becomes angry. And Moses said to Yahweh, "Why have you treated your servant so badly? Why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay the burden of all this people on me?" So even Moses is complaining. Did I conceive all this people? Did I conceive all this people? Did I give birth to them, that you should say to me, "Carry them on your bosom, as a nurse carries a sucking child, to the land that you promised on oath to their ancestors"? Where am I going to get meat to give all the people? For they come weeping to me, "Give us meat to eat." I am not able to carry all this people alone. So that sets up the story for what follows. Um, in the next section, um, chapter 11, 16, and following, um, God actually says, "I will come down and talk with you there, and I will take some of the spirit that is on you and put it on them." So this idea that spirit is on someone, and I think we know what that means. It doesn't necessarily mean God's self is in the person, but somehow there's some spirit, um, some power. And many religions have this idea of some sort of spiritual power or energy. And so God is actually coming down and talking to them. And then God says they complained a lot about meat. And the Lord says, I will give you meat. Yahweh says, you shall eat. You shall eat not only 1 day, 2 days, but 20 days, but a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you. So here's the idea. God is going to really pay them back for their complaining. And he saved them from slavery, but they're out in the wilderness and it's difficult. The people are complaining. They want their meat. And so God is going to give them an oversupply of quail. In 11:21, we have a number. Moses said, the people I am with number 600,000 on foot. And almost every scholar sees that as hyperbole, as exaggeration. And we really don't even have evidence for this time in the desert, but certainly 600,000 is an extraordinary number that is probably hyperbole, just self-aggrandizement, bragging, of making this event seem more great and awesome than it was if it even occurred in this way. In 11:33 and following, the Lord is still angry and he strikes the people with a plague, so some sort of illness, and we will see that repeatedly in the text. In verse 3 of chapter 12, we read, now the man Moses was very humble or devout or pious, more so than anyone else on the face of the earth. So scholars say this makes it seem that Moses could not have written the text because this seems really like bragging. Later on, we see this interesting text in verse 12:6. I, the Lord, I Yahweh, make myself known in visions, and I speak in dreams. So this is a very interesting idea philosophically for those of us trying to understand the divine with absolutely clear concepts. Maybe spirituality is more about visions, dreams, the will, wanting, seeing possibilities than abstract arguments. But nevertheless, it goes on to say, not so with my servant Moses. He's entrusted with all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly, not in riddles. And he beholds the form of the Lord. The context of chapter 12 is that Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses, which is why we saw the Lord say he speaks to Moses face to face. And the Lord went away from the tent, and Miriam had become leprous or white as snow. So she is removed from the camp for 7 days. In 13:23, Moses sends out spies to spy the promised land, and some of them come back and cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between the two of them. So a very large cluster of grapes that takes 2 men to carry back. Again, this is probably sacred hyperbole, exaggeration. And they say that the land is flowing with milk and honey in verse 27. So these are famous verses in all of Western and world literature. This idea of carrying the grapes between 2 men on a stick, and this idea of a land flowing with milk and honey. They also saw these Nephilim there in verse 13:33. And they seemed like grasshoppers to them. So they've seen giant people, the Nephilim, in the Promised Land. In chapter 14, we see the people rebel against the Lord again. The Lord, Yahweh, says to Moses, how long will this people despise me? And how long will they refuse to believe me in spite of all the signs that I have done among them? I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them. And I will make of you, Moses, a greater nation. one mightier than they. So here we have Yahweh threatening to destroy all the people and start again with Moses, as with Adam, start a new people. So this is um, a very troubling, even bizarre picture of the divine. Yahweh wants to destroy all these people, but Moses argues, what if the Egyptians hear about this? They will say, oh, it's because you couldn't bring the people to your land. Moses says, remember what you promised when you spoke. The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children to the third and fourth generation. So God is forgiving in this text. God is forgiving, has abounding steadfast love, and is slow to anger. But in all honesty, we haven't seen that in the text. God is Yahweh in this text is a very angry God, especially compared with other parts of the Hebrew Scriptures. And also we have this idea of visiting iniquity on people's children and grandchildren to the third and fourth generation. This idea somehow of inheritance of iniquity or sin, which I don't think is really acceptable to modern ears. In verse 19 of chapter 14, forgive the iniquity of the people according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have pardoned this people from Egypt until now. Then the Lord said, I do forgive, nevertheless, as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of this people have seen my glory and the signs I did in Egypt, and yet tested me, shall see the land I swore to give their ancestors. So God is saying, no, these people aren't good enough. Yeah, I won't destroy them, but they will be in the desert 40 years. They will not see the land. So God gave these signs, and I think of the Gospel of John, for which the first part is the book of signs. This idea of signs, that somehow something is done that shows something. 21, the glory of the Lord, which was also important for the second part of the Gospel of John, the book of glory. So this idea of the glory, the wonderfulness of God. And then we come to a very ironic and, I guess, tragic part of the story. As I live, says Yahweh, I will do to you the very things I heard you say. Your dead bodies shall fall in this very wilderness, and all of your number, included in the census, from 20 years old and upward, who have complained against me, not one of you shall come into the land which I swore to settle you, except Caleb and Joshua. Your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years. So this a book of Numbers starts out with this census of men over 20, and it turns out, oh, that's a list of people who are not going to make it to the promised land. Now, is any of this historical? We have no external evidence for any of this. And then we have to ask, what is the mythological, philosophical value of this? And that's a little more than I can do right now, and I'm just trying to give an overview of the study to note in particular aspects of how Yahweh is thought of here. And we've seen in the text that he's a very emotional God, very involved with the day-to-day events of the tribes, dealing with things on a one-on-one basis, actually coming down, and threatening people, threatening the crowd because of their complaints. So this is sort of a very fascinating aspect of the biblical tradition that most people don't really ever see unless you actually buckle down and read just about the entire Bible. And remember, it's not one Bible, it's ta biblia, the books, in plural, books. So each book has its own history, and here we see a very unique conception of the divine. So the Sabbath is very important in the Hebrew Scriptures, obviously, and that is very important, especially for priestly writers, those men who are working in the temple, say, or in the tent, because the practices of the Sabbath support them. So here we see in chapter 15:32 and following the story of what happens when you violate the Sabbath. They found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. They talked to the Lord, and Yahweh said to Moses, "The man shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him outside the camp." The whole congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death, just as Yahweh had commanded. So this is a very serious, deathly religion at this point. If you gather sticks on the Sabbath, that sin is so great that you are put to death. In chapter 16, we have another story of a revolt. Now, this one is not of all the people, but this is Korah and also some of the descendants of Reuben. And why it might be Reuben is Reuben was the firstborn, so maybe his descendants are thinking we should be in a more of a leadership role than Moses. And they make the argument all of the congregation is holy and not just Moses. But it turns out that the Lord opens the ground, opens the mouth of the ground, swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down to Sheol, this place under the earth. Not exactly hell, but a place where the dead go. And there were others who were fleeing, and fire came out from the Lord and consumed 250 men offering incense. So consumed by fire, something like lightning or divine fire. The congregation assembles against Moses. They don't like this, which is hardly believable, because if God just swallowed people on the earth and destroyed people with fire, I don't think they would start complaining again. But Yahweh says, "Get away from this congregation, this community, so that I may consume them in a moment." So God is ready and is going to be killing all of them. But Moses said to Aaron, "Take your censer and carry it to the congregation." And he does, and he makes atonement for the people. He stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was stopped. So God was going to give this plague to kill all of them. It stopped, but those who died were 14,000. Just an incredible story of this angry, vindictive Yahweh in this book. In chapter 17, we see the story of Aaron's rod blossoming. And this is important to know to understand Western art. You sometimes see this. Well, who is going to be the priest? Well, Aaron is going to be selected by God. Everyone brings their own staffs, and Aaron puts forth buds and actually produces blossoms and bears ripe almonds. So it's a miracle to show that his line is the priestly line. And that is a big debate, and especially the early part of the scriptures, who counts as a priest, who gets to be a priest. And this is God's stamp of approval by the blossoming of the dead stick. So we now have in Numbers chapter 20 this story about Moses. And this is going to be the reason Moses is not allowed into the promised land. So they go to a place and they need water. And Moses took a staff as the Lord had commanded him, and he talks to the people. "Listen, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water came out abundantly. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me to show my holiness before the eyes of the Israelites, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given to them." And scholars haven't quite figured it out. Is it because he's calling the people rebels? Is he saying we will bring out water instead of the Lord? Is it because he had to hit the rock twice? Did God tell him not to hit it? So scholars don't know, but nevertheless, the waters of Meribah are the reason Moses could not get into the promised land. And there seems to be a mystery. What exactly did they do wrong? So we're going to see this in the Hebrew scriptures that war is really an all-out war and close to being genocidal. So you're not just defeating the armies and occupying the towns. It's often total destruction of every living thing. The people revolt again in chapter 21. So the Lord Yahweh sends poisonous snakes among the people, and many died. So here we have God sending poisonous snakes to the people. Moses makes a bronze serpent, sets it on a pole, and everyone who bitten it looks at it, they get healed. So some sort of sympathetic magic, some sort of magical curing happens here. And it's interesting to note that snakes are often, from the ancient times, considered symbolic of healing for some reason. In 21:14, we see mention of the Book of the Wars of Yahweh, and we don't have that book. But here we have a mention of a text that we do not. In 22:29, chapter 22, verse 29, woe to you, O Moab! You are undone, O people of Shemosh. So Shemosh is actually the god of these people, the people of Moab, and we know this from the Mesha inscription, which was in 9th century BCE. So here we actually have some historical archaeological evidence for something in the Bible, this god of the Moabite people. Later in chapter 21, verses 33 and following, King Og of Bashan is defeated, so they killed him, his sons, and all his people. Again, this genocidal kind of warfare at the time, until there was no survivor left, and they took possession of his land. So this is an extremely brutal time in human history, and there's very little mention of the lack of humanity here. In chapter 22 and 23, we have the story of Balaam, Balaam the seer, Balaam the soothsayer. And one of the funny, really humorous parts is that God sends an angel to obstruct his way, and the donkey sees it and tries to get out of the way. Balaam does not see it, and this happens 2 or 3 times, and then the Lord opens the mouth of the donkey, and the donkey says, "What have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times?" And so this is funny. Here we have the famous story of the talking donkey. And what does this mean? Well, it's sort of confusing because Balaam actually gives these very positive prophecies about Israel. Balaam is not an Israelite. Yet he is said to speak with Yahweh. And the tradition is that later on, this story of the donkey was put in to make him look foolish. Why? Because here we have a prophet who was really not of the house of Israel. He was outside. So even though he speaks very, very positively, he is shown to be a buffoon. He's supposed to see what's real with God. He can't even see an angel right in front of him that the donkey sees. So it's a very funny story, but it has a purpose. There's the reason that it was probably put in later. Now, his oracles may come from the time of David, so about the year 1000. And the events that are supposed to be occurring now with the emergence of Israel are at about the year 1200. So these oracles might actually be very old. And then the story, the final version of the story is not probably written down till 800, 700, 600 BCE. So this story extends over many ages. Now, the funny thing is that recently there was actually an inscription that was found that makes note of Balaam the seer. It comes from about the year 800 BCE on a plastered wall. And if you had asked anyone, scholars, anyone, what story would you not think had anything historical about it, it might be the story of Balaam and the donkey. And yet, here again, we have some archaeological evidence that what is mentioned in the Hebrew Scriptures actually has some evidence. Now, was this Balaam a real individual, or is this just a tradition of a soothsayer? Nevertheless, we have some firm historicity here that Balaam was a well-known soothsayer and prophet from outside the Bible, from actual archaeological evidence. In chapter 25, we have two stories of apostasy, two stories of other gods being worshipped. So at the beginning of chapter 5, the men of Israel begin to have relations with the women of Moab. And so they go to their festivals, eat the meat that is sacrificed, eat the food, and bow down to their gods. And then it says that sort of infects all of Israel. They yoke itself to Baal, or Lord of Peor. And the Lord's anger, Yahweh's anger, was kindled. So the Lord said, Yahweh says, take all the chiefs of the people and impale them in the sun in order that the fierce anger of the Lord. And that is a little odd if the chiefs are to be impaled. So that's a little bit unclear. And then we have another story of one of the Israelites who comes back with a Midianite woman. And one of the priests, Phinehas, son of Eleazar and son of Aaron, takes a spear and kills them both. And there had been a plague going, apparently, because the plague was stopped amongst the people of Israel. Nevertheless, 24,000 died. So the plague hadn't been mentioned before, but it's occurring. And then Yahweh is so pleased with Phinehas killing this man and woman that he's given a covenant of perpetual priesthood because he was so zealous for his God, and he made his atonement for the Israelites. Again, another troubling and problematic story from the book of Numbers. In 27:14, Joshua will replace Moses because Moses did not show Yahweh's holiness at the waters of Meribah. We've talked about that. It's a little unclear what Moses did wrong, but nevertheless, he's got a very severe punishment. But that is a very famous aspect of the story that Moses leads the people to the edge of the promised land, but he does not get to enter. In chapter 31, they go to war against Midian. They kill every male. They take the women and their little ones captive, and they take their cattle. So in this case, they did not kill every single person, but just the males. And it says here, they also killed Balaam. Moses gets angry. Why did you let the women live? And the women were there supposedly on Balaam's advice and made the Israelites act treacherously at Peor, and so that there was a plague at that time. Now, therefore, Moses says, kill every male, kill every woman who has known a man by sleeping with him. But all the young girls who have not known a man by sleeping with a man, you can keep them for yourself, so as slaves. So here we have the answer to the question of why Balaam is killed and seen in a negative light. He is said to have helped in the treachery and the apostasy in the past. So even though he gave a good prophecy, it is said here that he made the Israelites act treacherously in the affair of Peor. So that is the reason why Balaam was considered negative, and that may be why there was a probable later edition of the story of Balaam and the talking donkey to make him look like a fool, even though his proclamations about Israel are extremely positive. In 33, 50, and following, these are the directions for how the Israelites are to conquer Canaan. In the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho, the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you cross over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, destroy all their figured stones, destroy all their cast images, and demolish all their high places." So places on hills where they would perform sacrifices to their various gods. "You shall take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have given you the land to possess." So that is the biblical account of the conquest. And scholars are not sure exactly how Israel came to be. Most doubt this idea of 600,000 traveling from Egypt coming in. There's no direct archaeological evidence for that. Many think it's a mix of some migrant tribes, some local peoples over hundreds of years developing this state. But nevertheless, this is almost painful to read, that there's no real concern for the people of the land. The Lord Yahweh has promised it to Israel, so basically just go in, kill the people, and take it. And I think at some level we really have to read this text and see it as exactly what it is saying. And it's terrible, it's genocidal, it's militaristic, and it's done in the name of Yahweh. I don't know how to sugarcoat this, but it's terrible here. The only blessing is perhaps it really didn't happen that way.